Welcome to the VSL Aviation Podcast, Seth Lake. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching on YouTube, thank you for joining me. This is our weekly installment where I answer your aviation questions. Most of these questions are coming from email and Discord and just general discussions that I have throughout the week. But if you'd like to join our live conversation, you can head over to vsl.aero. You'll find a link to our Discord community there. And you can also reach out to me directly at sethlake@vsl.aero if you want to ask an email question. If you're familiar with the YouTube videos or previous podcasts, this is a slightly different format. It's a little bit shorter and just a way for me to stay connected with you guys and have that good interaction. So each episode, I'm going to start out with the week's topics, and then we're going to jump over to the Discord channel and hopefully have a good conversation with everybody listening in live. So we're going to get started. This week's topics, we're going to cover threat and error management. We're going to talk about things you should be teaching as a CFI. We're going to talk about the alternate static source, 2025 updates to the FAR aim, and then your privileges as a CFI. Got some other topics there. We'll save those for another day. I think I'm going to have a guest on the next show, so I'm excited about that. But this show is just going to be us and everybody on Discord, so looking forward to that. So first, we're going to talk about threat and error management. So threat and error management is part of aeronautical decision making, which I've brought up on a few episodes. And what threat and error management is it's something that comes from kind of the crew resource management, sort of the airline world. And the reason I talked about this is, I guess last week I was in my crew resource management simulator for the Air Force. So in that, we have to go every year, and we spend about 4 days at our CRM sim. And what we do is we're put through the paces in a level D, full motion simulator. We have a lot of systems failures. We work on our crew resource management, running through checklists. And then at the very end, we run basically a type of mission that we go from beginning to end without using any of the simulator tricks. We don't speed the sim up. We don't slow the sim down. We don't pause or anything. We treat it like an actual mission. And reasonable system failures happen during that mission. And it's meant as an exercise for us to communicate to one another about how to handle that and bring the mission to a safe conclusion. It's not kind of a pass-fail. It's just, hey, what can we learn from our mistakes, and how can we trap these different errors and identify threats? That's what it's all about, is threat and error management. So what is threat and error management? It's the ability for you as an airman, or really just a person, because none of this is very specific to aviation. It's just life in general. It's your ability to identify that there's a threat there, and then be able to kind of manage that threat somehow. It's also your ability to overcome any errors, because that's another thing that happens. We have threats that are kind of external to us as airmen, and then we have errors that are internal, right? We make errors. The plane doesn't make errors, right? I guess the plane could make a malfunction, but that's external to us, so that would be a threat. But weather is a classic example of a threat. So adverse weather out there, that's a threat. If you don't get a weather briefing, you're not going to know about that threat, so you're not going to be able to manage it. So threat and error management is kind of, it can be broken down into your ability to look out there and see as many threats as possible and trying to put blockades around those somehow. And then we can talk about different methods for you to do that. And then it's your ability to trap or filter any errors that you might make yourself as an airman. And if you're working in a crewed environment, what you as a crew could make as an error. So an example of an error would be forgetting to put down the landing gear in a retractable gear airplane before you land. So that's an error. You didn't put it down at the right time. And a way to manage that type of error is we have checklists. So let's say that you normally put the landing gear down around 1,000 feet, and for whatever reason, you got distracted and that didn't happen. So as you pull power, a lot of retractable gear aircraft will start to give you a gear warning horn, right? That's a type of physical, mechanical device that's going to help you trap an error of landing with the gear up, because nobody wants to do that. The threat analysis, that's really up to you as an airman. So weather briefings, again, that's a big one. And then your ability to do like the I Am Safe tool, that's another great tool there. And I'm all about the practical sense of like, how do you do this stuff and what are some resources? So for that, I kind of got a little thread going in Discord. If you're not a Discord user, I kind of just discovered it recently, and I really like it. So we've got this VSL Discord, and I don't know, Discord's kind of hard to explain. It's sort of like it's a social media platform, but we've got a community that is just part of the VSL Aviation community, and we have different topics in our community. One of those is pilot resources. So if you're joining us on Discord, you can go over on the left-hand column. You can see pilot resources, and on there I've created a couple of different threads, and threads are kind of like threads of discussions within those individual topics. So the pilot resource topic, I've got a thread now on aeronautical decision making, and I started dropping some links in there that I think are all good links for aeronautical decision making, because threat and error management is kind of a subset of ADM. Threat and error management is something we do that is under the umbrella of aeronautical decision making. So on there, a type of threat and error management tool would be a flight risk assessment tool. So I'm going to click on that link and pull this up. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see the screen here. This is actually a really nice tool. The FAA, and I'm glad one of our, I forget who it was, but somebody on Discord pointed this out to me. The FAA had a flight risk assessment tool some years ago, and it was Excel format, and it was posted on the same place, and it just didn't work very well. They've since kind of updated it, but they haven't marketed it very well. Like I didn't hear about it until this Discord server. So I came back to it, and at first I thought it was going to be the same kind of Excel tool that just didn't work very good. But now it's web-based. I think it's in some sort of database type tool, but it's web-based anyway. You can't download it. So you do have to have internet connectivity, I think, for it to work right. But you can select your pilot type. So whether you're a VFR or IFR pilot, you select whether or not you have under 100 hours or over 100 hours. And then you just answer some basic questions about the pilot, the flight conditions, the airport, your flight plan, be it IFR or VFR, and the type approaches that might be available. And it spits out a total risk value and then tells you on a risk assessment, if your risk is between, 20 and 25, that's low risk. And if it's between 15 or 30 and 35, then that's moderate, and over 35 is high, and it's broken down for different types of experience levels for pilots. So all those questions and the radio buttons that you're answering, like crosswinds greater than 7 knots, that's a threat, right? So that's helping you identify the threats that could potentially impact you as a pilot. So going back to the ADM thread, there's another kind of threat analysis tool, and that comes from AOPA. And AOPA has a stress scale tool, and it's very similar to the FRAT tool. It's a stress scale, and you go through and you check the checkbox if it applies, and it assigns a value to that. And then at the very bottom of the screen, you'll have your total, and it'll say, hey, if you're over 300, you have a very high risk of becoming ill in the near future. 150 to 299, you have a moderate to high chance of becoming ill, and less than 150, you have a low or moderate chance of becoming ill in the near future. And it's just talking about stress. So when it's saying, become ill, basically that stress is wearing your body down, and you have a higher level of fatigue. So the higher that score is, the higher stress level you might have. So those are all personal threats that you might have. So those are a couple tools that are on there. I'm going to continue adding to these. Now, just on here right now, we've got the Risk Management Handbook, the Art of Aeronautical Decision Making. That's a course you can take. There's a AOPA Air Safety Institute VFR and IFR pilot contract for personal minimums. Those are kind of threat analysis tools. And then AOPA has a great ADM website, and I've linked that. And there's several videos you can watch there and courses you can take. But I've talked about this on many times. I think the last 3 shows I've talked about how aeronautical decision making is such a hard thing to teach. And this is kind of an effort that I'm putting forward to make it a little bit easier to learn and both to teach if you're an instructor. But all those things that are kind of hard to learn or hard to teach, they're very useful. They're important, right? Things that are important are normally kind of difficult to do. So just keep that in mind. Don't just do the easy stuff. We gotta eat our vegetables and do the hard stuff sometimes as well. So if you're listening to this on most people are going to listen to this on podcast and or YouTube, kind of split in between there. I think there's like 7 people on Discord. So hopefully I have more than 7 listeners out there in the world. I think so. But if you're listening to this at a later date, you can check out Discord. I'll also try to start working more on the website. I'm kind of a one-man band here. I do the website and I do the Discord, and sometimes, I got to let things fall through and I don't always update the website. But for those that don't want to use Discord, totally understand that. I'll try to get some of these companion sites on the website that has the links to all these tools that are out there. All right, next up, I wanted to talk about, and this came up 2 different questions, of what things should you be teaching as a CFI? And I thought this was an interesting topic because and that's the way a lot of these work, is when somebody asks the question and I start to answer the question, it may be something that I used to know a lot better than I do now. But just in me digging up kind of some solid resources to answer a question, I make maybe some new discoveries that either I've forgotten and known before, or this is just totally new. And I think this is one of the latter. It's just a totally new way for me to think about this. So I just did a CFI exam today, and this is one of the things we talked about is, you get your first student, what are you going to be teaching? And kind of the typical answer that I get from a lot of CFIs is, well, I'm going to use the Airman Certification Standards and the Airplane Flying Handbook, and I'm going to make sure my private pilot student has mastered all of those skills so they can be successful at the check ride. And that's not a terrible answer, right? I totally get that as an answer. But really, to me, that's like teaching the test. And that's not necessarily your primary job as a CFI. And that sounds maybe a little funny coming from me specifically, because I kind of built this channel on teaching people how to use the ACS. And maybe this is me trying to make a little bit of a course correction there. I don't want everybody to be just hyper-focused on that Airman Certification Standards. Although it is important for you to go into your check ride to understand how that works, it's not the guideline for how you make a safe pilot. And so what I wanted to point out, I'm going to pull up the ACE guide here real quick and just point out some stuff. So here's the private pilot ACS. And we've got areas of operation 1 through 12. So we have 12 areas of operation here. Some of these won't even apply if you're teaching a new private pilot, because it's stuff like seaplane and multi-engine stuff. But this isn't the only stuff you should be teaching to your private pilot. There's really important stuff out there that doesn't exist in the private pilot ACS. And one of those places is actually another ACS. It's the ACS you use to become a CFI. So the kind of the epiphany that I had is that when you're deciding on what you're going to teach your new students, you should really look to the CFI ACS, because everything in the CFI ACS is something that the FAA expects you to be able to teach, or at least demonstrate to a student. And so I think we're missing out, especially at the private pilot level, instrument pilot level, really commercial, those first 3 core check rides that you do. Your instructor is really teaching you everything that's in that test, and they're not teaching you the stuff that they had to demonstrate themselves on their CFI test. So let's look at some of those things that you might be missing out on if you're in your private pilot training. So one that I really, really love is in the CFI, the new CFI ACS, we have Area of Operation 10, Task B, which is demonstration of flight characteristics at various configurations and airspeeds. And it's essentially a drag demo, right? You're getting the airplane and you're flying it around at minimum maneuvering airspeed, and the stall horn's going to be blaring, and you're going to be hanging on the prop, and it is the slowest that you can fly the airplane. And this sort of exercise is actually a really good tool for you as a private pilot to master the ACS slow flight, which isn't real slow flight, right? I understand that ACS calls it slow flight, but it's not real slow flight. It's like slow-ish flight. But real slow flight, that stall warning device is just going to be blaring, right? It's going to be on because the stall warning is giving you a buffer above stall, right? If the stall warning came on right as you stalled the airplane, it wouldn't be that useful. And that's true for all kinds of aircraft. In fact, the airliner that I fly or the military aircraft that I fly, their first stall indicators are usually, a 5 to 10% buffer over our actual stall speed. And that makes total sense, right? Because that gives you time to identify, hey, I'm in a slow or a high angle of attack situation. I need to decrease my angle of attack. I need to unload the wing. So it totally makes sense that it comes on at a buffer. But because of that, when we're training to fly at min speed, at our min controllable airspeed, then that means if we're flying with the stall horn going on or with the stall horn off, then we're about 10% above our minimum controllable airspeed, because our minimum controllable airspeed is just that whatever, 1 knot above the speed at which we're going to lose control. And that may sound a little scary, because I think there's a lot of people that are scared of spins, and that's something we're going to talk about next week probably is spins, because I've kind of been going on a deep dive on spins and spirals. But people are scared of spins, especially new pilots. And they think, okay, if I get slow, if I stall, I could spin. Therefore, when they're slow, they're a little nervous. And when people are nervous or have anxiety about things, they can't think clearly. They have this anxiety, and they can basically panic when something bad happens. And that's really what we're trying to inoculate you, if to use that term. We're trying to inoculate you from that anxiety of those slow airspeeds and a wing dropping potentially. We don't want you to panic. We want you to calmly react, because the things we're asking you to do during those events, they aren't necessarily instinctive. I call them counter-instinctive reactions or learned behaviors. And what I mean by that is when a wing drops during a stall, we've got a lot of instinctive things, biologically in our head, right? Or the seat of the pants feel. We're tilting to the right. We don't want to go right. So we're going to jerk our hands to the left, because that aileron that's the typical device we use to make the plane go left and right. And so the instinctive reaction is going to be to yank those ailerons over to the left. And that's going to cause a lot of adverse yaw on our right wing, which is already proven that it's stalled because it dropped. And it could drive us into a spin. Well, now we hear the stall horn going off. We're tilting to the right. We've got opposite aileron. So we're driving that wing deeper into a stall. And then you've got this Pavlovian response of, if you hear the stall horn, you want to jam in the power. So here we find ourselves in the incipient phase of a spin, and you're basically doing all the wrong things. You've got full power in, you've got opposite aileron. Maybe you're not using your rudders enough, because the rudders, there's very little instinctive reaction to use our feet to fight yaw. That's not a real instinctive thing that we have as people. Our yaw, and maybe I don't know what I'm talking about here, but I feel like this is kind of my theory on the world is, Tuk dragging a stick through the forest, 20,000 years ago or whatever. He never really experienced the sensation of yaw, right? Now he tripped and fell, and, his vestibular system helped him keep upright, so he can kind of understand the pitch and roll access. But the yaw access, there's really not a lot of, biological stuff that can sense yaw. That's why student pilots are so bad at yaw. Because that's a learned kind of behavior to control the yaw of the airplane. So when we're dealing with these panicked situations where a pilot's panicking, they're very unlikely to use that learned behavior. So what we need to do is make sure that they don't panic during those situations. We want to make you comfortable with the low speed flight regime of the airplane. And that means when you do get into a stall, you're going to be much more calm and you're going to do the right thing, because we don't want you to panic when the plane stalls. Now, ideally, we want to train you in a way where the plane never stalls unless you want it to stall, right? But there are times where you want the plane to stall. It's about once a flight, whenever you want to come in and land, right? So landing, you're flying in a slow flight regime. And so getting the feeling of those mushy controls and stuff, that's a really important skill. So this demonstration here will also help you master the skill of landing, I think, a lot better. So that's one of the things that CFIs should be teaching that I don't think they are, and it's in the CFI ACS. The other stuff, a lot of that comes from Section 10 as well, and that's the accelerated stalls. I think accelerated stalls should be taught to private pilots. You need to master it as a CFI, so you should have no problem teaching it. Don't not teach something because it's not in the ACS for the private pilot. That's a bad reason not to teach something. The accelerated stalls, that's a great thing to teach your private pilot students. Another thing that I really think should be taught to everybody is the cross-controlled stall demonstration. And there is a problem here, though. The way the airplane flying handbook talks about cross-controlled stalls, I don't really agree with, because it describes an event where it's more like you have overshooting winds and you're in a base to final and you overshoot the runway and you make an aggressive correction back, and then for whatever reason you use a cross-controlled there. The overshooting doesn't make sense to me, because I think the instinctive thing is you're going to try to cheat with rudder and you're going to step on bottom rudder and you're going to go into a skid. And then maybe to avoid the spin, you might go cross-controlled slightly. But if you were to do a skidding turn like that in a stall, it would basically be a spin. And clearly the FAA is not asking us to demonstrate a spin here. They're asking us to demonstrate a cross-controlled stall. So I think maybe something that makes more sense to teach the cross-controlled stall is the forward slip to land, right? Because as a private pilot, well, let's just go over to the private pilot ACS real quick. Our takeoffs and landings, task M in the private pilot ACS requires us to do a forward slip to a landing. And this kind of blows my mind, the fact that we don't do forward slip stalls, because we're asking you to do a forward slip landing. In fact, we're asking you to do it so much that you have to demonstrate it during the check ride. But we're not teaching you how to, well, the stall characteristics of a plane in a cross-controlled condition, which of course a forward slip is a cross-controlled flight maneuver that we do. And so what I wind up asking a lot of private pilots is, basically how does this plane get into a spin? Because it's one of the things we talk about on the ground. Because I want to make sure the private pilots know, at least conceptually, what a spin is and how they get in one. And they normally tell me something like, well, a spin is I get into a stall and I'm not coordinated. Okay, so you mean that when the ball's not centered, if you were to stall, you're probably going to spin. And they're like, yeah, definitely. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, I've got a video on YouTube that shows me that I can go on a full forward slip and a fully developed stall, and the plane won't spin. It's completely stable. And of course, this is just, I'm talking about straight wing aircraft, but I've tried it in basically every straight wing single engine aircraft that I've flown. I cannot get a straight wing aircraft to spin from a slipped condition. And that's a full cross control. I've got full right rudder, left aileron down. But the important part is I've always got top rudder. And what I mean by that is, if you think top and bottom rudder as the plane is banked about the roll axis, if I'm banking to the left, then my right rudder is the top rudder. If I'm stepping on that top rudder and I'm bearing the left wing, that's a forward slip, and I'm not going to stall. Or I'm not going to spin in that condition. It's going to be very weirdly stable. You'll probably settle into about 1,000 feet a minute at an airspeed probably right at stall speed, maybe 5 knots slower than stall speed. So this is actually a good maneuver to do to prep somebody for a spin, because it looks a lot like a spin from the gauge standpoint, right? So during a spin, we would typically see a low airspeed below stall speed. We would see a high vertical speed, negative, of course, about 1,000 to 2,000 feet a minute, depending on the plane. We'd see our altimeter decreasing, right? The only thing different is in a forward slip, you're not going to see your directional gyros aren't going to be spinning because you're going to be holding a heading. But it's a very similar kind of flight profile to a fully developed spin. But that's something that I think CFIs should be teaching. So all the stuff in Area of Operation 10, teach that to your students at the private pilot level. You don't have to make them master it, right? But it is good to teach it to them for demonstration purposes. And that kind of gets into the applied aerodynamics, is I would like CFIs to do what they can to demonstrate applied aerodynamics. And what I mean by that is we teach a ground school about aerodynamics, and you might teach about stability, right? So most private pilots, right, hopefully all private pilots, they've at least learned about our positive dynamic stability, positive static stability, right? They've heard those words and phrases, and they may know maybe a little conceptually about what that means exactly, but almost none of them have ever been demonstrated what that actually means in the airplane. And it's actually pretty easy to do in the airplane. So you can demonstrate positive dynamic longitudinal stability very easy, right? Get the airplane in trim condition, and then just disturb the airplane. Either add power or pull the nose up, and then let go of the controls. You're going to hold your heading using a rudder, and what you'll see is that longitudinal stability will kick in, and it will start to oscillate up and down, but the oscillations will get slower, and eventually they will level out, and you're back to your trimmed condition. Well, that's positive dynamic stability of the longitudinal axis. It's really that simple, right? It's very easy to demonstrate those. You can demonstrate the roll stability, the same thing. Get it in a trim condition, put it in a standard rate turn, and let go of the controls and see what the airplane does. Now, depending on the age and condition and kind of the rigging of your airplane, it may have a little bit of divergent stability, meaning that it will continue to enter into a roll that will steepen and eventually develop into a spiral. That's something that could happen. I had actually seen that recently. So the other thing that you'll see is hopefully you'll see a positive stability where you bank into a standard rate turn, release the controls, and it's going to roll back to wings level. And you can demonstrate, hey, that's the inherent stability of this airplane. That's why aircraft engineers design it that way, so it's inherently stable. If we let go of the controls, it's not just going to completely, lose control and crash. And that's a really good demo to show your private pilot students, especially those that might have some anxiety about the airplane, because then you're proving to them, and you're also correlating that ground knowledge that you taught them. You're proving to them that the airplane is inherently stable. So I think it's a really good thing to teach. But one more thing, and this is also in the ACE guide. Not that this is an ACE guide commercial, but this is all the stuff that I use on a daily basis. Advisory Circular 6167 Charlie, and that's the stall and spin awareness training. And I really think flight instructors should be using this AC more. And if you go to the flight training for stalls, it actually is one of the best written ACs when it comes to just kind of a ready-made lesson plan. And right here on page 9, it has your stall avoidance practice at slow flight. And it has about 11 different things that you can do, including utilizing realistic distractions. And it gives you a list, A through K, of different types of distractions you can assign your student in the slow flight regime. And you can combine this with the CFI skill of that drag demo that I showed you. But this is such a good, just little lesson that you can do, and you're still accomplishing the training that they're going to need to demonstrate for the ACS for the check ride, but it's also way more in depth than what you can get in the ACS. So this advisory circular, highly recommend everybody take a look at that. It's in the ACE guide. You can get it for free on the FAA site as well. It's AC 6167 Charlie. So, all right, that's what I have to say about what you should be teaching as a CFI. How about we hear from anybody in the Discord?
Hey, Seth. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I really like the CFI ACS. There's, some of the other demonstration stalls that are really good. The secondary stall, the elevator trim stall, very pertinent also to showing student pilots what can happen in these scenarios, so that they've seen it at least a couple times, once or twice, and when if they get into those scenarios, they know what to do. And speaking of other stuff that's not like what should CFIs be teaching, yeah, the ACS is a really good starting point. But then there's other things like, how do you prepare your student? Really, like the mindset I have is like, how do you prepare your student for when he gets his ticket, that you're confident, and the FAA is confident that he can handle him or herself, um, anywhere they go, because they can go anywhere, even internationally. And so, both from an aerospace perspective, from an environmental perspective, mountain flying, stuff like that. Not that you're going to provide mountain flying specialty training, maybe like at a sea level airport, but at least give them some of the basics, and then provide recommendations on, hey, if you want to ever do this, go. You should go and get this additional training, supplemental type training. Mountain flying just sticks out to me as being one of those specialty type trainings that people should go do. But guess what? That's not a requirement to go through that type of training as a private pilot, or instrument or commercial pilot, right? So there are a lot of other things. Is the point that pilots need to know to be able to handle themselves anywhere they go around the country, or international. So, and that's not required to be taught, right? Necessarily through ACS or PTS standards. So,
Yeah, absolutely. One of those things, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that, is I think about it when I go to a big flight school that is usually at a towered field and they have full service fueling. Fueling an aircraft safely, that's not in the ACS, right? I don't have to see them fuel the aircraft safely, but that's also like an important skill to have as a private pilot, because you're probably going to find yourself at some point, if you fly long enough, having to service your own airplane. And a lot of these pilots that have grown up, as it were, flying at a full service field, they've maybe never put fuel in the airplane. So that's one of those basic things you need to be thinking as a CFI, is building those opportunities for your student to learn things that is not listed in the ACS, like you're saying.
I think a good way to think about the ACS is that it is effectively the bare minimum. So, like, this bare minimum is more than enough to pass a check ride, but you should not be training your students to just the bare minimum. You should be training them to go beyond that, because going beyond that is what's going to, save their skin as they get out into the real world and exercise their privileges.
Yeah, absolutely.
another good example, Seth, that people, that's not required, but is a good idea to, if you can, expose your students, is like, grass strips, or dirt strips or something like that. That's not required, right? Anywhere in the training. Yes, we practice soft field and short field landings and takeoffs, but
More specifically, like being able to do things like inspection passes on those fields. What to look for and when to know if like a field is wet or if there's like terrain, things to watch out for.
Okay, the next topic, this one will probably be shorter, and well, it'll definitely be shorter, but I just kind of an info message that I want to get out to the public here, and that is the alternate static source. And my argument is the alternate static source is part of your anti-icing feature of the airplane. I just want to make sure everybody understands that clearly. And I actually can't find a reference to prove my point that it is an actual anti-ice feature of most aircraft. But, here's what happens normally. I go out on an instrument check ride, and one of the required items, of course, for us to talk about, and again, I can pull up the instrument ACS here. Area of Operation 2, Pre-Flight Procedures. Task A is aircraft systems related to instrument flight rules. And it's basically talking about your anti-icing, de-icing systems. Most 172s, or if I'm in an Archer or something, they're not going to have any official like flight into known icing equipment like de-ice boots or heated fuel probes and heated windshields, stuff that you'd need to fly into icing. They simply have usually a pitot heat. They have windshield defrost. And then sometimes they'll have either carb heat or alternate air. And those are the three things that the applicant lists off to me. And then I seem to always say, and I'd say 90% of the time, I'm like, okay, there's one more. And they kind of look around the airplane and maybe throw out some guesses like the cabin heat or something like that. And eventually I'm like, no, it's the alternate static source. And the reason I argue that the alternate static source is part of your de-icing is if your pitot heat is icing over, or you're worried that your pitot heat or your pitot tube could be icing over, then chances are your static port could be taking on ice as well. Now I realize it's not at like a real ice prone area, but it could be picking up ice, right, for sure. And you're not going to damage anything by turning that alternate static source on. And the other thing is, if your pitot tube freezes over, you're going to know pretty immediately because your airspeed is going to go to zero, right? It's pretty obvious when the pitot tube fails. It's going to go to zero. But if your static system fails, that's a lot more of an insidious failure, right? You may not know it immediately, right? So I wouldn't wait for the static source to start acting funky in icing situation until I turn on that alternate static source. So the habit pattern that I want to get people into is if they're in a condition where they think that pitot heat is really important, and I'm not just saying like 10 degrees visible moisture, I'm saying, yeah, I see ice on the airframe. Hey, pitot heat is definitely on, and that alternate static source is coming open. So I just wanted everybody, public service announcement, your alternate static source is part of your anti-icing features of your basic airplane. Does anybody have any hot takes on that I'm wrong?
I mean, only from a purely semantical standpoint, because we define like anti-ice and de-ice equipment as items that directly interact with the ice, either by preventing it or by removing it. The alternate static does neither, but at the same time, you're not likely to use alternate static, except in the case where either the static port is blocked or it's iced over. So, takes a one half a dozen with the other.
Yeah, I agree that there's a semantic issue of calling it anti-ice. I still argue that it could be looked at anti-ice because it's limiting the impact that the ice has on you, right? So it may not be actually melting the ice or breaking the ice up or keeping the ice from forming, but it's preventing the ice from having a negative impact on your operation. So in that case, I think it's anti-ice. But I guess, in theory, it could be useful for other things. And, I've had other people say, well, it's for, debris could clog it too. And again, I guess debris could clog your static source. I don't know how that would happen, but, sure, it could happen. It just seems like the most obvious thing that is going to block that static port is going to be, ice. So.
One thing I want to say about stuff blocking static ports, when I was flying the Diamond 40s, frequently if you flew into heavy amounts of rain, the static port would get clogged up by the water just flowing over the surface of the aircraft. So
yeah,
that's one thing that happens a lot with blocking static ports.
Yeah,
that's usually why static systems will like have a dedicated like humidity bulb to like catch that water.
Yep.
But that being said, there's another thing that can just as easily block a static port. It comes down to two words: dirt daubers.
Could be, yeah, for sure. And that is a mechanism where you may not realize that is blocked, and then when you start taking off and your pitot-static system is acting weird, hey, okay, we'll turn that on. So yeah, there's other things, but my argument is if you're in icing conditions and you don't have a heated static port, that needs to be turned on, because chances are you could be picking up ice over that. But I'm willing to admit that I'm totally wrong and you shouldn't be doing that, but I think you should. All right, the next topic I'm going to talk about are the 2025 updates to the FAR and AIM, the FAR AIM book. Now, I love the FAR AIM book. I used to get them all the time. I don't currently purchase ASA's version of the FAR AIM. And I've got a whole little thing of where a lot of pilots think the FAR AIM is like an FAA thing, but it's really just a brilliant marketing ploy by ASA, because ASA essentially takes certain FARs, they select a few FARs that they think are important pilots have ready access to, and then they take the Aeronautical Information Manual and they publish it in this book. And as far as I can tell, they've been doing that since the 60s, maybe even before, I'm not sure. But it's basically universal, right? Every pilot knows what that is, and it's to the point where they think that it's an actual FAA publication. And I think it's funny because they'll show up to a check ride, and I've had a few applicants say, "Hey, I've got an expired FAR AIM. Is that legal to use in the check ride?" I'm like, "Well, it's not even an FAA document, so as long as you have a computer and you can go to the ECFR website, which is the source data for that, and you can go to the Aeronautical Information Manual, which is the FAA has that set up as a website now as well, then you have the actual copies, so you just use that if you're going to reference it." But anyway, I digress there. The ASA does a great job, and this 2025 FAR AIM update is current as of January 6th. And in yellow, they've highlighted kind of all of the changes and when the date happened and the source of that. So you can kind of quickly go through here and see all the different parts with the major changes. And then that's at the FARs. So it's not all the FARs, it's just a few of them. And then it has the Aeronautical Information Manual explanation of major changes. And that's on page 23 there. And it goes through the major changes in the AIM, and then has those changes there. So I thought that was a really useful manual and thought I would shout it out on the podcast here. Everybody, if you just Google search 2025 FAR AIM update, that should be the first thing that pops up, and it's from ASA. All right, on to our last topic before we open it up for discussion, and that's going to be our privileges as a CFI. So this is a question that I've been asked. Well, I've seen it asked in a few different formats, a couple on Reddit, once on email, basically what a CFI can do. And a privileges of a basic CFI, it's really, you can teach everything but instrument stuff. And the instrument stuff that you can't teach, that you need a double I for, that's specifically outlined in the privileges and limitations of the CFI FAR section. But that doesn't include the flight by sole reference to instruments that you can do as a private pilot. And that's where the confusion seems to happen, is a basic CFI knows that they can do the 3 hours of flight by sole reference to instruments. And that is a little bit of, there's some semantic statements going on there, or semantics to that statement. The FAA on purpose called the 3 hours of instrument flight training that you receive as a private pilot, they don't call it instrument training, they call it flight by sole reference to instruments, because that's not instrument training. So you can do that as a basic CFI. But as a CFI, if you try to give actual instrument training for somebody that's maybe using that time to qualify for their instrument exam, or even the hours required for the commercial, right? There's 10 hours of instrument training required by the commercial. That's actual instrument training, and you can't do that training as a basic CFI. You can only do that training as a CFII, right? You need your II to do anything other than just the private pilot stuff there. Another thing you can't do as a CFI is you can't give an IPC, right? An IPC has to be given by at least a II. A DPE can also do that, but II. I've seen just a couple of discussions on there on Reddit about what CFIs can and can't do. So, and unfortunately, the FARs can be a little confusing here. So, there are several legal interpretations. So, if you go to the ACE Guide, legal interpretations, I'll just talk about a couple of the legal interpretations that affect or that maybe more clearly outline what a CFI can do in terms of training here. So on this, I've got them broken down, and I've got a brief description, like one sentence or two, and the name of the LOI. And then if you click on that, it takes you to kind of closer to a synopsis of that LOI. And then you can click on another button, and it'll take you to the actual legal interpretation there. All right, so we'll look at Grayson, and this is called Grayson 3 because there's several Grayson LOIs. But Grayson 3 is from 2010, and instrument training and instructor endorsements. So this interpretation explains that a CFI without an instrument rating on their flight instructor certificate cannot provide any instrument training toward an instrument rating. Additionally, CFIs must maintain records of all solo endorsements they issue. And that goes on. Yeah, so that covers a couple different things. So this question has come up a lot, right? This is back in 2010, and here we are in 2025. And there's still people on Reddit and Facebook and sending me emails asking if they can provide this type of training. So the short answer is we could probably do a longer show on just like all the limitations and privileges of a CFI. Get with whoever you're doing your CFI ground school, or get with a more senior CFI, or you can send me a question through email and I'm happy to answer it for you. But just know that, there's a lot of restrictions you have as a CFI. Of stuff that you cannot do. And there's some recent rule changes that actually affect that we still haven't quite seen how they're going to be implemented, but that in terms of, we'll call it a senior CFI or a 2-year CFI. Because as a 2-year CFI, you can train new CFIs, but we want you to have more experience. Well, the FAA implemented a new rule change where there's a new way for you to get that experience other than just waiting 2 years. But we haven't quite seen that implemented yet, and I'll probably update you here on the podcast when it does happen. All right, well, that is my topics that I wanted to cover for today. We've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 people in the chat. Anybody want to jump in and talk about anything?
The CFR privileges is a good one. It's interesting because, a lot of people always forget about sport pilot, recreational pilot. They also forget about, like you said, a basic CFI can teach everything except for instrument training type stuff, right? So what does that mean? That means that, I mean, we're excluding multi out of that, I guess, right? But I mean, is there anything in the multi training that they can do? Is there anything in the ATP training they can do, like a basic CFI can do for someone? I don't know. It's kind of a question mark.
Yeah, so I've actually run into this. You could get your basic CFI in a multi, right? I mean, that is a thing that you could do. You could do your initial CFI in a multi. We tend to colloquially, we kind of call it a CFI, a II, and an MEI. Well, there's really no such thing as an MEI as far as the FAA is concerned. There's just a flight instructor with multi-engine privileges. And there's also a flight instructor with single-engine privileges. I run into this in the military all the time, whereas the older generation military guys that didn't fly the T6, they started out flying the T1, and then they went on to the T-38, which is a twin engine as well. So their initial training was a twin engine jet. Their secondary trainer was a twin engine jet, and then they went on to fly like the C-130. So they go to retire 20 years later, and they've been an instructor, in the C-130 by then. So they've got their multi-private, their multi-commercial, their multi-instrument through military equivalency. And they've got their MEI and their CFII, but they don't have single engine privileges on their flight instructor certificate. So let's say you get your CFI initial, and then you add multi-engine without adding an instrument. So you only have single engine and multi-engine privileges, and you want to teach somebody a multi-engine rating. Well, if you go to, let's pull up the commercial Part 61 requirements. If you go down for the airplane multi-engine rating, if you're looking at an added class, you're not required to teach anything out of 61-129 if you're adding a class. And most people are adding that as a class, right? They're not doing their initial multi. I've talked about that before. So I think you could make the argument, without your double I, you could probably teach multi-engine rating, right? You could sign somebody off there because there's no instrument training required by that training profile for added class. Now, your applicant is going to have to demonstrate instrument skills on the check ride, but there's no instrument training required. So I don't really know on that. If I was going to do that a lot, I would probably want to get a legal interpretation. I don't know that there is a legal interpretation on that, but that's kind of a gray area. As far as the ATP goes, I think that's more of a clean kill. That the ATP, at least to sign off an ATP, you would need your instrument training there, because a large part of that rating is instrument, and there's no like added category or class there that you'd be doing. So as far as maybe some of the flight training, if you were just a basic CFI and a multi and didn't have your double I, and you wanted to go teach them, give them dual given in a multi, you could do that. But again, you couldn't sign them off. But there is no dual received requirements for the ATP either, which is kind of surprising. I don't know if everybody is aware of that. It's not like you have to get 3 hours of training to sit for your ATP and be signed off. You can just go take it.
Thanks, Seth. Appreciate the clarification.
You bet. Dylan, you still here? You took your commercial multi recently, right? Tell us about it. Was it amazing? Was it great?
Round was short and sweet. I knew exactly. So I'm at a 141 school. I had the privilege of, so many people have gone through this DBE. I know exactly which questions this DBA is probably going to ask. So I already had answers to each question that I thought he was going to ask. So it went smooth as can be. And yeah, flight portion. Nothing of note really happened. I mean, it was by far one of my smoothest check rides to date.
Great to hear. Yeah, I think the multi-engine rating is one of my favorite to give. I've given a lot of them, and I enjoy doing the multi add-on. So I'm glad you had a good experience.
Thank you.
So Seth, with regards to your things that you were talking with about CFI should be teaching,
yeah,
I'm just gonna kind of throw this out there because it seemed to be like I was even trying to organize my thoughts on how to like make whatever statement I was gonna make or even talk about it, because it seems like there's a big rabbit hole in there on like what type of CFI you get, as a student, and basically like, my CFI experience, like he was great, he taught a lot of stuff that necessarily probably wasn't, just written down in the ACS or the PTS. The aeronautical decision making part of it was drilled in, like, from day one. We did a lot of scenario based training, even like some night cross country stuff.
Yeah, I remember that.
It's crazy. But basically what I'm getting at is if you get a CFI that's just giving you the bare minimum of like getting these ACS things done, like, how do you think that the culture as far as within the CFI ranks needs to change as far as like, hey, I know you may be doing this just to get to the airlines, but your responsibility is a lot higher than you think. And like, how do you think that we should be looking as students picking CFIs? How do you think you should look into that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I agree wholeheartedly that the culture of our CFIs need to change. And I take that on as my responsibility. That's experienced CFI's responsibilities. It's all our responsibilities, but primarily our experienced examiners and CFIs. We do need to try to change the culture from looking at it as just this is a checkbox. I need this so I can build time and go to the airlines. And you need to take it more seriously than that. I mean, it is that, and it's just one of those things that I can't change that, so that it is part of what being a CFI is building experience, for better or worse. But I do see a lot of CFIs, both firsthand and just anecdotally from places like social media, because of social media, it's so easy to find those examples of CFIs that are, they're just milling through, just the classic pilot mill. It's like, hey, I've got these 16 things we need to do this week, so we're going to do those 16 things, and then I'm going to move on to my next student. And when you're done with that folder, that TCO, if you're at a 141, your course standards, and you've got your phase checks all done and you're signed off, they send you to the check ride, and then rinse and repeat, So there is some sort of balance, right? Because if we were to try to teach you everything that you need as a pilot, absolutely everything, your pilot training would take a really long time. So that's sort of the reason why we call the private pilot kind of the license to learn, because it is a little bit of a license to learn. And instructor that I really respect, Rod Machado, he talks about this, and one of his problems, in fact, with the airman certification standards when they came out several years ago was that it brought too much of the kind of what I was talking about earlier, too much of the risk management and threat and error management and CRM topics. It brought too much down to the private pilot level. And essentially, paraphrasing a little bit, his idea was that, when we're training a private pilot, we're not training an airline pilot, right? We're training a private pilot. So we need to be focused on those fundamental skills of handling a light aircraft safely. Maybe they don't need to be the best at threat and error management because they're very limited in what they can do already. There's only a certain amount of threats, you can expose yourself to in a Cessna 150, for instance, right? Because as a private pilot without an instrument rating, there's just not a lot of advanced stuff that you can be doing in that type of airplane. So why are we teaching these really advanced skills? And I agree a lot with him. And that may sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I guess if I could explain it in a way where we have so much that we're trying to teach private pilots that I empathize with those instructors that feel a little bit overwhelmed, and like, yeah, we can't dwell too much on one subject because we have all of these subjects to cover, and there's time constraints, and we got to go and get everything done. So a lot of it boils down to knowing what you really need to focus on and what you could kind of hand off to self-study, for instance. A lot of self-study needs to happen. It's not all the CFI's responsibility. You need to know as a private pilot that you need to be exercising those, chair flying skills and going out there and finding other resources to study and prepare. And then the challenge as a CFI is knowing what you need to focus on specifically. Like And it's those fundamental skills that I really wish CFIs would do a better job focusing on. But I think, I feel like I'm talking in circles here, but I think what's happened is the FAA's thrown so many requirements into the ACS that our CFIs feel a little bit overwhelmed. They don't have good guidance on what they need to really focus on. And it's kind of the difference between being able to demonstrate or perform a skill up to standards and having someone demonstrate that to you. So we need to do a better job at defining what that is. What things do I want you to have mastery of as a private pilot, and what things do I just want to kind of expose you to at a very basic level and have you have a working knowledge of. That's where I don't see maybe CFIs triaging it correctly. And what happens is eventually it just gets overwhelmed and they're, okay, I'll just teach you the test because I know I've got this ACS. We got to perform all these skills, so we do all that. And if you look at the ACS, I think what a lot of instructors are focused in on are those skills sections, because they know, hey, I have to perform all of those skills, and the knowledge and risk management just kind of get thrown out because we got to do all the skills. So that's a problem. But yeah, back to your point, I kind of went down a rabbit hole. I feel like it's tough because there's a lot of young instructors that just don't have a lot of experience, and they themselves probably don't know what you really need to focus in on. So they're just going to focus on what they had to do during the check ride, which may or may not be the greatest stuff. But as a private pilot, a lot of this is just, we want to make sure you can do the basics safely, and then you're going to go out there and learn a lot after you get your rating.
I mean, yeah, like I said, I was saying I had a fantastic private pilot experience. And it almost seems like if you couple like a set of standards like they give you with the ACS, and then the whole like kind of race to the bottom pricing, financial aspect of things, you get a set of younger CFIs that are doing the best they can, overwhelmed. You got students that can, it's expensive, and it's because it almost seems like it would be a case of like each individual student would kind of need different things from the standpoint of like risk management or whatnot, and how do you work that into the standards that you got to meet for just a check ride. But it's just a topic to discuss, not necessarily questions or anything.
Yeah, I was kind of like, just to add on, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, there's only so much we can do to prepare them for the real world. There's, I mentioned mountain flying training. There's G1000 training, upset training. I mean, all the additional endorsements, high performance complex. There's also backcountry flying. How can we prepare them for all of that? We can't. We got to find like what to talk about that type of stuff and make them familiar with it, and inform them that if they're going to go do any of that specialty type stuff, which in some people's lives, those are not specialty. That's just like normal life for some, depending on where you live. But just to let them know that stuff exists and they should go do that. Bush flying. There's countless things that people can go get additional training on. That's just right outside that private pilot gate. That they need to be really covered well, and if they want to go anywhere in the country or the world, even. So, over.
Yeah, I agree. To use, I love my analogies, but to kind of use an analogy here is if, I'm teaching my daughter how to, we got her a credit card and a savings account and a checking account and a Roth IRA, and I'm teaching her money management skills. And when you're teaching somebody how to manage money, when it comes to like spending, I don't have to take her to like every store imaginable and show her how to buy everything, right? I don't need to do that. We don't need to go to all these different stores and show her. I just need to show her how to use and manage her basic money, and then give her kind of the decision-making skills to decide what she's going to go out and spend her money on. But the physical act of like buying something is pretty straightforward. I can show her, okay, here, take your credit card, you put it in the device, and hopefully you did your due diligence to make sure you're not overpaying for this thing. And then you want to track, hey, how did that money affect my budget and all that? We don't need to go out and show her how to buy shoes and milk and clothing separately. The skill of buying something is pretty interchangeable. A lot of the aviation stuff is kind of similar in that I don't need you as a private pilot. I don't have to teach you how to fly a seaplane and a plane on skis and a tailwheel aircraft and a multi-engine aircraft. I teach you how to fly one aircraft, and I really teach you how to learn how to fly an airplane. That's what the private pilot's all about, is I'm teaching you how to learn how to fly an airplane. And then it's up to you to go out there and explore the wide world of aviation and learn how to fly other stuff. I don't have to do that as an instructor. Our job as a primary instructor for a private pilot is to build those fundamental skills of like, okay, how do there's airworthiness requirements. I don't need to know all the airworthiness requirements for like a lighter than air, balloon, but I know that there are airworthiness requirements. I know that there's a operating handbook. There's things called weight and balance. Those fundamentals, I learn how to do that, and I can apply it later on once I get my rating to other things out there. So, hopefully that lets you not be so overwhelmed as a CFI, is just work on those fundamental skills. And we've kind of talked about a little bit of that, and I'll talk more on the next show about spins and slow flight. That handling an airplane in its full flight regime, that's a really important, fundamental skill that I wish we spent more time on, rather than we do an aerodynamic lesson, we kind of do all the ground school, and then when it moves to flight phases, we just go up and say, okay, we're going to do this thing called steep turns. Meanwhile, you've never been demonstrated to how in a steep turn, that overbanking tendency causes that's actually it's where your stability becomes divergent and it could enter into a spiral, right? You learned all that stuff, and there's almost a divide between your ground school learning and what you learned in the plane. And that's what I feel like's missing is kind of that fundamental knowledge.
Just remembering back to my primary training X number of years ago, like I didn't get to solo until I could do Dutch rolls. And that was, my primary instructor was a World War II pilot, OP-51s. And he knew the plane I was flying and learning in. And it surprised me, resuming like the commercial training and instrument training, that those kind of maneuvers and skills aren't even really thought about, or some people don't even like recognize that they exist and how valuable they are.
Yeah. I think that's one of the benefits of having a couple of different instructors through your primary training instead of just one, because you get exposed to a lot of different teaching styles and some techniques. And I was the same way. My instructor was an older, more experienced instructor. He wasn't a professional instructor, but he was, I saw him as a professional pilot. He was a professional. But getting to learn from him and then going to the Air Force and learning to fly there, getting totally different techniques, but still remembering back to the core fundamentals that he taught, it was good. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us again. I look forward to talking with y'all next week. Again, you can reach out to me at Seth Lake at VSL.aero. You can go to our website, VSL.aero, to find out how to join our Discord channel and community and participate live in an upcoming podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.